This is a production of Cornell University.
Okay, well, thank you. Sorry we couldn't meet in person. We've been talking about this presentation for some time and had to make it virtual, but we'll do the best we can. So I am the statewide vegetable pathologist for Indiana, and as such, I get a lot of questions about fungicides. The question that I want to talk about today is the interaction between rain and fungicides. And the photo here is tomato plants in the foreground, but we have a storm cloud coming. So I want to talk about the interaction of perhaps fungicides placed on these tomato plants with the storm coming. But really, I have to kind of back up and also talk today a little bit about the interaction between disease and rain, plant disease and rain. So in going around Indiana, these are three of the most common questions that I get. The first question, and we'll try to answer these questions today: should I wait until it rains before I apply a fungicide? In other words, a rain is predicted for this afternoon or tomorrow. Should I wait until after that rain before I apply a fungicide, or should I apply it before? The second related question then is, if I apply a fungicide before rain, how long before the rain is safe? An hour, 2 hours, 12 hours? Um, third question is, I applied a fungicide yesterday and it rained today. Should I reapply that fungicide? So first, let's go back and why do we apply fungicides? And of course, we apply fungicides to help with disease, but it's important to remember we apply fungicides to help prevent foliar disease. We don't, uh, it really doesn't do it much good or any good to apply fungicides to already diseased plants. So we want to apply fungicides on a regular basis to prevent foliar disease. Most foliar diseases, and this is the critical point here, most foliar diseases require water on the leaf surface. Because you have to have water to allow those spores to infect the leaf. So I show a photo of anthracnose of watermelon here, but I could show many different foliar diseases of vegetables that where water is required for that infection to occur. Rain is then necessary to disperse those spores. So if you imagine a raindrop hitting these lesions here, and it would splash the spores to other leaves. So rain is just the critical component of spreading most foliar diseases of vegetables. So if you decide to zone out here, the most important point is if at all possible, have your fungicides applied before the rain, not after, before the rain, because rain is where you most need those fungicides to protect the leaf. So I'd like to clear up a term before I go on, and that term is rain fastness or rain fast. There's different complicated definitions, but it essentially comes down to the effectiveness of a foliar fungicide application after a rain event. How well does your fungicide work after the rain has occurred? And you see here a watermelon leaf with a fungicide on the leaf. I'll be talking about labels and fungicides, and so rain fast or rain fastness is one thing you'd want to search your fungicide label for, this term. So when I was first asked to give this talk several years ago, I thought, well, this will be easy. I'll just search the labels for rain fast or rain fastness, and then go through each label, and then I'll come up with, for each label, when is it rain fast or is it rain fast? What conditions under which it is it rain fast? So I didn't search every single label, I suppose, but I searched the vast majority of labels that you would use in vegetable production, and their search results were disappointing. Few of the products, and we'll see these in a moment, few of these products had information on rain fastness on the label. This was true regardless of the name. For example, a Mancozeb product, diethane rain shield, you'd think that would say something about rain fastness, but it did not. Bravo Weather Stick, a chlorothalonil product, also just says nothing on the label about whether or how long before it's rain fast. This is what I found. So I'd like to go over this. There's not many products, and I'd like to go over these because they'll give you a sense of what to look for. So the first product is Approach, and if you look on the label, it says it's rain fast after an hour. Well, that tells you exactly what you want to know. If you apply Approach an hour before a rain, it is they're standing behind that product being rain fast. There's a couple of copper products, Champ and Coside, which say 8 hours, but only for ginseng. So that must have been special research. Curzate, 2 hours. Endura and Pristine both say yes. Well, what does that mean? Well, essentially, I guess it means that the manufacturer is standing behind that Endura and Pristine are rain fast, but they're not telling you how long, what period of time to wait. Fontellus and Vertisan both say an hour. Monsoon, Onset, Toledo, and I think Vibe is in that group, 2 to 4 hours. Presidio's 2 hours. We mentioned Pristine. Propamax, Quilt XL, Quilt, and Tilt all say dry. So what this apparently means is when the product is dry in the leaf, which does not take long, the manufacturer is saying these products are rain fast. Rhyme is 2 hours, and Tanos 1 hour. I searched some selected organic labels, and again, did not find much. Millstop and Serenade Opti had verbiage such that you have to apply them more often during rainy weather. And then Oxidate had a comment about rainy weather and severe conditions, which I don't understand because Oxidate doesn't have any residue. I don't see how it interacts with rain at all, but that's another story. So I didn't find much. What factors affect rain fast? And the top factor that we'll talk about today is whether the product is a contact or a systemic. Some people will call a contact a protectant. So a contact product is one that remains on the surface, like a chlorothalonil or a Mancozeb product, remains on the surface of the leaf. Contact products tend to be more, because they're on the surface of the plant, they tend to be more susceptible to rain and wash off than systemic products which move into the plant. So because I was not able to find a lot on the labels, what I want to do now is go through and talk about some studies that scientists have done, scientists like myself who have done studies where they put a rain machine in a greenhouse and apply fungicides and turn on the rain machine for various amounts and various amounts of time and see what happens to answer just the question which we've been asking here. And so I'll go over that and I'll try to make that information as digestible as possible. I wanted to mention that after I gave this talk the last time, somebody turned me on to a YouTube video with industry scientists talking about fungicides, and they were talking about how the vast majority of fungicides are systemic, and the only limit to how fast they put it on the label was the time between when the fungicide was applied to these plants and the time when they could get it in the rain chamber. But if that's true, I have not found that for the most part on the label. So we'll go ahead and examine those products. So first, we'll talk about contact fungicides. The first product we'll talk about is a chlorothalonil product, Daconel Weather Stick. They found this group here found high loss from rain 60 minutes or less after application, and they found that they concluded that it was best to apply this product 8 to 24 hours before a rain, and they were working with dollar spot on creeping bentgrass. So we'll come back to that time period because I think for many Mancozeb for many contact products, that 8 to 24 hour interval sounds like it makes a lot of sense. Here's another chlorothalonil product, Bravo 500. In this case, they're applying it on potato. They found rainfall on the day of application was produced the greatest loss of residue, which makes sense that that falls into that 8 to 24-hour period that we just mentioned. They found residue loss from the top of the plant, but even if it lost residue from the top of the plant, there was some redistribution to the bottom leaves. Small amounts of rain were removed from some of the fungicide residue. Small amounts of rain removed some of the fungicide residue, but the remaining was difficult to remove. So the initial rain removed some, but what was on the leaf tended to stay on the leaf. Here's some mancozeb products, diethane and Ventum. This group was using 24-hour residue and 0.6 inches of rain, and they reduced mancozeb residues by 40%. They were working with apple leaves. Here's another mancozeb product, diethane ultra. A 1/5 inch of rain is what they used 4 hours after application. They found a 75% loss of residue when they were working with apple leaves as well. They recommended a drying time of at least 4 hours, and they recommended using whatever adjuvants were on the label. And that's something that I think is important, whether for rain fast or for other purposes. If the label lists an adjuvant, I would use that unless you have good reason not to. And this comment on diethane F45 said that addition of a registered surfactant will improve initial spray deposits, fungicide redistribution, and weatherability, which I would think includes rain fastness. So here's copper product. The copper products are also products that are susceptible. They're contact products. They're on the outside of the leaf, in this case an apple leaf, and they are susceptible to being washed off as well. This group used 0.2 inches of rain 3 hours after application and found that 0.2 inches of rain washed off 80% of the copper. Here's Anna McSchendler's group at Michigan State University. She was working with 24-hour residue. 1 inch of rain, she found, removed 50% of the residue, and 2 inches rain removed the remaining. And I think she was working with grapes. So let's move on to systemic fungicides. Now, these are fungicides which move into the leaf, and what we'll find is, for the most part, systemic fungicides that move into the leaf are less susceptible to being washed off. So here's a group that's using the product Secure or Omega, the active ingredient fluazinem. They found it was effective even 15 minutes after rain. So fluazinem is interesting because it's a contact fungicide. It doesn't move once it's in the leaf, but it does move into the leaf, and that in itself was enough to make it very rain fast. They were working with dollar spot and creeping bent grass, and they recommended 1 hour of rain fastness. 1 hour, after 1 hour, it was rain fast. Here's an oxystrobin product, Heritage, effective even 15 minutes after a rain. They're working with brown patch and fall fescue, and so they also recommended 1 hour of rain fast. It was rain fast after an hour. This is Anna McSchendler's group, again at Michigan State, using a Quadris product, 1 day old residue. They found 2 inches of rain did not reduce effectiveness, but that same rain reduced the residue to 60%. So interestingly enough, a lot of rain reduced the residue, but it didn't reduce the effectiveness, and she was working with Phomopsis and grapes. So what factors then reduce fungicide residue? Well, any kind of weathering, that could be rain, as we've been talking about, or wind, but UV radiation, sunlight, will reduce fungicide residue over time. And then, of course, growth. If your plants are growing, then for the most part, that growth is not going to have fungicide residue on them. So let's return to those questions then. Rain fastness. The first question, should I wait until it rains before I apply a fungicide? And I would say, in most cases, apply a fungicide before a rain. It's important to get that fungicide on before it rains, because a rain event is when that disease gets spread around. So in most cases, apply the fungicide before a rain. If I apply a fungicide before rain, how long before it's rain fast? Well, I don't know if there's any sure answer on this unless it's on the label, and I urge you to look at the label. But For contact products, a good rule of thumb is 8 to 24 hours before rain, it becomes rain fastness. And I would say most systemic products seem to be in an hour or two. I applied a fungicide yesterday and it rained today. Should I reapply? In most cases, I would say not today. If you applied a fungicide yesterday and it rained today, I would not apply something else today or tomorrow, but you might increase the frequency. If it was really severe rain, maybe instead of waiting 7 days, you want to go 5 days, or maybe instead of waiting 10 days, you want to go 7 days. But I wouldn't go back and apply the fungicide again right away. Older residues are more likely to need reapplication. So if you are on a 10-day schedule and you get a really bad rain at 8 days, you might want to go ahead and reapply. And then, as we've mentioned, contact products are more likely to need reapplication than systemic products. So let's go over then some rules for fungicide applications. Apply most fungicides on a 7 to 14 day schedule. So we mentioned weathering and growth, and for those reasons, most fungicides will need application during the season. You'll have more frequent applications in wet weather, not just because we're washing off the residue, but because as we've seen, wet weather is linked closely to disease. So if it's raining a lot, we want more fungicide applications. And if it's in August and it's really dry, we can probably spread those out to a 2-week schedule. In Indiana, we have a weather-based disease forecasting system for cucurbits. In that case, go ahead and use that, and that takes the guesswork out of the when to spray. But as I say, for most crops, I would use a 14-day minimum. Apply protectants 8 to 24 hours before rain if you can. Apply the protectant or the contact product before a rain if you possibly can, but probably after 8 to 24 hours, it's probably going to be rain fast. Systemics, like I say, I'm thinking 1 to 2 hours before a rain. Check your pre-harvest interval. Don't forget that when you're scheduling fungicides, and then check the label for more information. And like I say, I tried to check most of the labels, but you will of course want to check the label you're using for any information about rain fastness. So when I give this talk, I'm often, somebody will come up to me afterwards or from the audience and tell me a story like this. This is so one of the growers that I work closely with tells this story. So this grower has an adult son, and this is several years ago, back when pretty much all we had to spray was chlorothalonil. And he sent his son out to spray his watermelon field. The son went out spraying. We got one of these southern Indiana toad strangler rains. Tractor got stuck, and the dad had to go and rescue the son out of the tractor. And then a few days later, they had to go and pull the tractor out, and of course, that made huge ruts. Well, what the grower noticed is right up into the point where the son had been spraying fungicide, there was less disease. After the point where the tractor had gotten stuck, there was more disease. So this doesn't fall into that 8 to 24 hour period like I mentioned, but still, if you can possibly get that fungicide on before rain, you should probably just go ahead and put it on. Because the rain is really when you need that fungicide on the leaf, because rain is what is closely linked to disease. And I have one more story to tell you. My mentor here and the man who had this job before I did, Dr. Rick Latin here at Purdue, who's now retired. When growers would ask him this question, should I wait until the rain to spray my fungicides, he would give a football analogy. He would say, if waiting to put your fungicides on after rain is like putting your football helmet on after the game. When you need the helmet is during the game. When you need the fungicide on is during the rain. So, and with that, here's my contact information. I'd be glad to answer questions.
Well, we're typing perhaps, Dan. I want to say that was a really interesting talk. One question I had is, did you come across any research on, in furrow at planting fungicides and the effect of big rain events right after that? Obviously a different story than foliar applications. I'm just curious.
No, I haven't done that. That's another good question, but I guess it's a different story because I think rain and foliar diseases are linked so much. Um, I guess no. The answer is no. I haven't done any research, but I've often thought that when I'm applying fungicides on and I want the root to take it up, I'd rather do it when the soil is dry so that it can take it up. But I really haven't done any research on that.
Here's a question from Laura Perkins. And her question is, do freak warm, wet days like today in Ithaca and Geneva open the possibility of infection?
So, it's interesting. I'm not quite sure, what you have out there on a day like today, strawberries or something like that. I would, so when I think about infection windows, I think about two things. I think about warm weather, peach leaf curl. Okay. Yeah, I don't, uh, I guess I don't know a lot about peach leaf curl, but yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, we're at 38 degrees, so you guys must be warmer than us. You have to, uh, yeah, I'm just really not sure. I think when I think about infection windows, I think about temperature, but I also think about time. So you have to have, probably 12 hours or however many hours at that temperature. And if you have that amount of time, and can't remember what peach leaf curl is, then yeah, I think it's possible. But you have to have that leaf material out there. Do you have peach leaves out now? I'm not sure. Uh, one of the other questions was, should we mix protectant and a systemic? I just think that's pretty much always a good idea and I think somebody's going to be talking about FRAC codes, mode of action codes, and I think that gets into to that. But it's probably not a bad idea to mix protectant with a systemic. Maybe that next speaker will address that.
Yeah, I've got another question for you on the chat from Dan Wickstead, and it reads, with climate change, more heavy rain events are happening. What level of rain event are label statements based on? 1 inch per hour, for example, 1 inch per hour?
That's a good question. Like I said, I was turned on to this video, and they were very optimistic about these industry people were very optimistic about the rain fastness, but they did not mention how whether it was an inch or 2 inches or something like that. I guess I would say that if it's in the leaf, it's in the leaf. If it's a systemic product, and it doesn't really matter. It's more maybe if you have a contact or protectant product on the leaf, that's when the total amount is going to vary. And of course, the other thing which wasn't asked, but with Phytophthora with Phytophthora diseases, I've noticed. Well, everybody knows, I guess, that when you have that puddling rain, that's really a factor.
Great, thanks so much. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for your attention today as we go through some of the basics of pesticide use. Today, I have one goal for you. Well, two goals, I should say. I have two goals that I want you to get out of this talk as we start rolling into our, April is coming close, and soon we'll be thinking about fungicides and pesticides. I want you to know what are FRAC codes and why should we bother with them? Why do we care? There are these things that are on the label. Then you might just sort of your eyes glaze over and you're like, it's just a bunch of numbers amongst a bunch of other bunch of numbers. But they're actually incredibly important. And they're important because more than 80% of the crops grown in the United States are treated with some form of fungicide, whether it be a broad spectrum, whether it be a single site, a biopesticide. There are, a big concern, right, is crop loss due to fungicides, or sorry, due to fungi, and fungicides are our best tool that we have to combat these pathogens. As a quick refresher before I go into the actual talk of what are FRAC codes, I want to just go over some terminology. Fungicides, when I'm describing those, is a compound that kills a fungal organism or their reproductive spores. A fungistatic is a compound that's going to inhibit the growth of a fungal organism. It's not going to kill it outright. In general, you can separate fungicides into two categories. There's your conventionals, which are synthetic compounds engineered for specificity, efficacy, safety, and reduced input. They're usually the ones with a big price tag. And then you've got your biofungicides. And I'm going to say, I might use the word biopesticide interchangeably, but remember that biopesticide is an umbrella term that also includes insecticides, herbicides, a pest of some sort. But biofungicide is the most accurate term to be using when we're talking about a fungal specific compound. But biofungicides are naturally occurring fungicidal substances. And these can be microorganisms, living organisms that are going to kill fungi. They could be the byproducts of microorganisms, or they could be plant incorporated protectants that are going to act on the plant such that its immune system is boosted to fight off fungal infection. Now, fungicides have many modes of action, and in general, they have two broad categories. They can have a multi-site mode of action, meaning that the compound in question will inhibit a range of enzymes or cellular structures in a non-systemic way. It's just going to be able to hammer the fungi from all fronts in order to kill it or suppress it such that you don't get disease development. Or the compound might be a single site fungicide, meaning that it's going to act at a specific point in a biosynthetic pathway in the pathogen. So it would, for example, work to inhibit the ability of the fungal spores to germinate, or it's going to inhibit the ability of the fungus to produce energy such that it can keep growing once it's already established on a plant surface. And when it comes to single sites, that's where the focus of this talk is going to be, because resistance is our biggest concern, and that is decreased susceptibility of a pathogen population in your orchard or in your field to a specific fungicide. And that's where FRAC comes in. So FRAC, or the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee, was founded as a way to prevent and manage the use of fungicides to prevent fungicide resistance. FRAC is a specialist technical group of an organization called CropLife International, which represents the plant science industry all around the world. Their members include major players in the crop protection industry. So think of, Bayer, BASF, Corteva. They all have representatives on this group, as well as fungicidal scientists from all over the world from the major universities. And the reason that they're so vested in keeping, using this FRAC system in order to keep fungicides effective for longer is that it's very expensive to bring fungicides to market. So here's an example of a 2018 report that gives you a sense of what it takes to bring a fungicide to market. It's going to take you around 11 years and a little over $300 million to discover, develop, and register a new fungicide. And that doesn't even include the cost of then marketing it and then getting it out to production. This is just to invent the darn thing and get it out the door. So we need to make sure that these products, which are very expensive to produce and very expensive to buy, are available as long as possible so that we don't reduce the number of tools in our toolkit to manage the diseases that are most concerning to us as growers. So a FRAC code is going to be found on every fungicide label in the United States. You're going to find it displayed prominently, usually on the first page or right on the front if you're looking at your bottle. So you'll find it usually in some form like this, group, and then a code itself like P5, group 21, or in this case, you might find some products that are actually a mix of two different FRAC chemistries. In this case, 7 and 11 for this product is called Marathon. And they're sort of a tool to help you quickly generate your fungicide application plan as you go into your growing season. So when it comes to single site fungicides, FRACs are registered for a limited number of uses per season, and you should be rotating fungicides with different FRAC groups throughout your growing season. And I'll get into why we do that in a second. Remember, we're just answering the what right now. So FRAC recommends, for example, that you shouldn't be using no fewer than 3 different FRAC compounds or in any given growing season, or for multi-spray crops like potatoes, which have a lot of input requirements, you should be using no fewer than 5 different FRAC compounds. Because you want to be using different modes of action per crop / disease combination that you're most concerned about in your particular crop for effective resistance management. So my experience is largely with apples. That's where most of my research is conducted. So I want to give you that information in the context of an apple management disease plan. So what we have here is a fungicide schedule for any generic growing season. On the left here, you've got the growth stage of apple through its different phenological stages as you go from the early spring in late March, early April, depending on the season, as far as the midsummer around second cover. We've got our target pathogens, apple scab and powdery mildew, that we're most concerned about as the fungal diseases of concern for apple management. And here are the commercial products and the active ingredients that those products contain. And most importantly are the FRAC codes. So if you're laying out your fungicide plan for the growing season, you can sort of look down and use these tools to help you quickly see, hey, am I rotating my FRAC codes enough? Am I including enough of a variety to meet the requirements that FRAC, the organization, recommends, such that I don't have disease fungicide resistant concerns. So for example, here for apples, I would recommend using something like Aprovia, a FRAC 7, Inspire Super, which is actually a mix of 3 and 9, or Flint Extra 11, and I'm using them and I'm alternating them, rotating them, such that I don't use any one product too many times in a given season, and I don't go over the total number of 4 applications of a particular FRAC code in a growing season. So with the what of FRAC codes answered, they're a tool in order for us to effectively manage fungicide resistance in the pathogen populations of concern. Why? Why do we care about it? And the answer is fungicide resistance. So let's go back to that grower with that schedule again and pretend that, well, he's not interested in rotating his fungicides. Instead, they're much more interested in just using the same old product over and over and over because one, yeah, it's expensive to have to buy 3 or 4 different compounds, right? There's an upfront cost associated with buying, 6 or 7 compounds of different FRAC chemistries. And also you use what you know, right? Somebody tells you down the street or, Sunday at church, hey, I use Aprovia. It's great. It does the job. So I'll just use that for everything. So here's a situation where a grower has just decided to use some multi-sites in their early season just to deal with the low disease pressure. But as the pressure really ramps up through the rest of the growing season, they start using Aprovia all season long. And they do this year, next year, the year after that, and they do this for the next 5 years. And that's where we get fungicide resistance to come from. So there's 3 phases of fungicide resistance. There's emergence, which I've just sort of shown to you in that table form, where the grower has used the same product, in this case, Aprovia, a FRAC group 7, over and over and over for many years. Now, I do want to stress here that the emergence of fungicide resistance in a particular fungal population is not due to the fungicide itself. Fungicides are not inherently mutagenic. They're not creating mutations that lead to resistance. Instead, what a fungicide is doing is it's selecting for pre-existing mutations already found in the population of the fungi that you're most concerned about. These fungi are getting these mutations due to the shuffling of their genetic material when they reproduce. And I will point that these advantageous mutations occur very infrequently. So that's why we don't have reports of fungicide resistance every single day. It takes time in order for these mutations to, 1, develop, and then 2, be selected for. Now, selection is the second phase of resistance development in a fungal population. So if this grower keeps using, say, for example, Aprovia over and over and over, it will select, it will remove the sensitive isolates from his, in this case, orchard, but it could be a field. And you'll be left with only your resistant isolates, this subpopulation of that total fungal population that you're concerned about. Let's just say the grower doesn't notice this and they just keep using the same products over and over and over. And that's actually going to lead to establishment, because by removing all of the sensitive isolates, you've effectively freed up all of this free real estate for the resistant isolate to take over. All this green tissue that is now theirs to conquer because there's nothing else, nothing for them to, to slow them down, and the current fungicides being used aren't effective. So at this point, the grower is wasting their money, in short words, because it's not going to do the job that they're setting out to do by applying fungicides in the first place. So this is the goal of using FRACs, to make sure that this process, emergence, selection, and establishment, doesn't occur. So I want to go through sort of a Q&A of sort of the common questions that I get about using the use of FRAC codes and fungicide resistance in general. I will say that like I said, I work largely in apples, so that's sort of the lens that I'm looking through things, but this does apply to sort of fungal pathogens in general, whether it be an orchard or a field. So my first question that I often get is, how far will a resistant pathogen population move? And I'll say here that it largely depends on the pathogen's dispersal method. This comes down to the biology of the pathogen and has nothing to do with whether or not it's resistant to a fungicide or not. In general, airborne pathogens are the most concerning. We've learned that, with a human pathogen relatively recently. So if we look at this chart here, a soil-borne fungal pathogen is going to be most concerning at the plant scale, right? So think of like a soil-borne fungi like Pythium. It's just not going to be able to move terribly far in the soil. It will be able to move somewhat in the soil, but it's not going to be able to get to the field scale and move from one end of your field to the other 100 meters away. And it's certainly not going to move from farm to farm without some extra help. A waterborne pathogen is going to follow a similar style, right? Within a field, especially on a sopping wet field, think of like Phytophthora, for example, it's going to be able to affect plants in a broad patch. It might even be able to move within the field reasonably well, as long as if there's a conduit for that water to travel and the pathogen to move with it. But from farm to farm, again, that's going to be very low. It's airborne that's your biggest concern, because once those spores are released, it's really a matter of how far the wind carries them, and they are able to find tissue to land on and set up shop again. That sort of limits its dispersal. I will make a point here that human activity is going to modify dispersal dramatically. So for example, a soil-borne pathogen that you normally wouldn't care about beyond the plant scale could be an issue at the farm scale if, for example, you're not sanitizing your tractor after a particularly, driving through a field that has a historical prevalence of soil-borne pathogens. Or with waterborne pathogens, say you've got irrigation lines that you're not cleaning out that have been infected, and then you're just moving that equipment from site to site. You're just taking the pathogen with it. So keep that in mind when it comes to resistance, right? These are the vectors by which a fungicide resistant population might be able to move around. Another question I get is it better to rotate products of different FRAC groups after one application or two applications? And the answer is that it doesn't really matter within season how frequently you're rotating, as long as you're following those label requirements of a max number of applications in a given year, which is for the single sites largely 4, because the time needed for fungicide resistance to develop in a fungal population is on a seasonal to multi-year scale. So with our apple grower example, that person was spraying a FRAC 7 for many, many years in a row that led to fungicide resistance development in that population. It's not just going to be a week-to-week thing that leads to resistance. It doesn't typically happen that fast, although I reserve the right to find biology to surprise us in a way and to beat us to it. Now, if you have a pathogen population resistant to a specific FRAC group, let's say that FRAC 7 in that example earlier, will that person be ever able to use fungicides from that group effectively again? And if so, how long do they have to wait? The answer, unfortunately, is unclear and totally up to the pathogen of concern. It really depends. Sometimes a pathogen may revert. So here's an example of a resistant isolate in your, let's say, a field or an orchard, and the grower stops using a particular FRAC group that led to the resistance in question, and they have to wait a long time. And that time, indeterminate, totally dependent on the pathogen and the resistance mutation that they have, whether or not the mutation is removed over many generations or only after a few generations of that fungal population. It might regain sensitivity and you'll be able to use that FRAC group in the future, or, which is the situation we don't want, the pathogen population maintains that resistance permanently and then spreads it elsewhere. And it sort of becomes the normal status of that particular fungal pathogen. So this is the situation we're certainly not interested in. This is why it's so important to rotate FRAC groups such that we don't have the situation arise. To give you a case study, to sort of see how long could you have to wait to see resistant sensitivity to a particular FRAC group come back. In apple, there's a disease called apple scab caused by a fungus called Ventria inequalis. And in the years leading up to 2000, in New York and Michigan orchards, there was a compound called dodine, FRAC group U12, that was incredibly effective against this pathogen, and it was used very widely. However, resistance appeared, and we had to take it off the market. But my advisor, Garrett Cox, who works on this system, did some work in the early 2000s to see how long would it take for dodine to be effective again. So as we look at these charts here, this on the y-axis is the percentage of orchards indicating how many of those isolates were able to grow in the presence of dodine. So on the x-axis is dodine here, and how many of the isolates can grow in a lot of dodine versus are very sensitive to dodine and they die off very easily. So in 2004, right after they stopped using dodine and the resistance was at its highest peak, many isolates were able to grow in the presence of this compound, indicating that they were resistant. And then as 2007, 2009, and then actually 10 years later, 11 years later from 2000, the amount of pathogen that could successfully grow in dodine had reduced, meaning that it had become sensitive to this compound, and you could start using dodine again. However, because of the liberal use of dodine back early before 2000, it isn't even really used by growers that much anymore because of resistance, resistance coming back fears. So it's better to have not gotten into the situation in the first place. But if we do get into the situation, you might be in for a very long wait before you might be able to use that compound again. Now, are there FRAC groups where resistance in pathogens develops more quickly than others? And the answer is yes. And this sort of reiterates the need to rotate your FRAC groups. The FRAC groups with the highest resistance development, which I will say are also some of the most effective fungicides, include the QOIs, that's your FRAC group 11, the dicarboxamides and the SDHIs, 2 and 7 respectively, and then the DMIs and the APs, 3 and 9. Other single sites such as the PPs and the KRIs, 12 and 17, have low to medium resistance, but they're not as popular because they aren't necessarily as effective as, say, the QOIs and SDHIs, especially when you've only got so many limited dollars for fungicide, purchases, and you want to buy what works the first time. If you're curious about whether or not the FRAC groups that you are using in your fields and orchards have what their risk profile is for resistance development, I encourage you to go to www.frac.info, and you're going to download the FRAC code table, and this is a segment of it specifically for the DMIs, FRAC group 3. And you go hunt down the FRAC code that you're interested in, 3 in this case. And if you look in the comments, it'll tell you what is the risk. In this case, for the DMIs, for 3, it's medium risk. Now, if you have resistance or decreased efficacy to a particular FRAC group in your orchard or in your field against a particular fungal pathogen that you're concerned about, is it okay to continue using it to manage the other fungal pathogens in your field and orchard? And I'm going to tell you right now, ideally, no. Ideally, you stop using that particular FRAC group altogether and you set it aside such that sensitivity to that FRAC group in the pathogen that is now not, it's not working on as well, sort of comes back. But we know, as we've seen earlier, it takes some time sometimes to do that. So your management program is probably focusing on your most troublesome diseases, not just one disease. And it's inevitable that you're going to keep on using a certain FRAC group. But why should you try not to do that? And this is due to two things, something called multiple resistance or cross resistance. In a scenario where multiple resistance is formed, a fungal pathogen is going to develop resistance to 2 unrelated fungicide classes. So going back to that grower who used FRAC group 7 and used just Aprovia all season long, that's already been lost to them. FRAC group 7s they're resistant to, but then they come along and because they weren't able to rotate effectively, now they're starting to see resistance to a completely different FRAC group, say FRAC group 3, for example. And once again, they're wasting their money and they've got a big problem on their hands when it comes to protecting their crop. In cross resistance, it's a situation where the pathogen is going to show resistance to multiple fungicides within the same mode of action. So Aprovia, FRAC group 7, FRAC group 7, which includes a compound like Aprovia. There's also other products within that label that now might not be as effective as well because they're hitting a similar target within the fungal pathogen. So that means you're going to lose an entire FRAC group, not just one specific product within that FRAC group. And that's a huge concern as you only have so many FRAC groups to work with to manage your diseases. One of the biggest questions I get is, are higher or lower rates better for resistance management? You come in swinging with the highest rate possible and just try to burn out the fungi that's causing a problem, or do you just sort of like apply a low dose, but you maybe more frequently, or just try to find a way to sort of burn it out slowly? This is going to be different for, I encourage you to talk with your extension arm of wherever you're growing, because I can't speak to a lot of different pathogens other than those in apple, but our data suggests that for apple scab, you're going to want to apply a high rate right away every single time. Low doses applied year after year may be promoting resistance because it's just sort of like it's like drip feeding the fungus with that fungicide too slowly such that it's able to select for resistance. So we recommend the use of high dose rates and FRAC group rotation, along with a liberal use of multi-site fungicides and biopesticides in rotation. I will say that human and veterinary medicine has taken the same approach, right? Like if a doctor prescribed you an antibiotic or an antifungal, you wouldn't take half of your dose or stop halfway through your treatment program, right? You know, you need to take the entire course of the medicine to burn out whatever is causing the problem in you or in your orchard, respectively. So where do biofungicides fit into this FRAC code picture? Well, they're cataloged too. The code BM, or biologicals with multiple modes of action, is used for biopesticides. The great thing about biopesticides is that there isn't any resistance. They have a very low risk of resistance development in the fungal pathogens that they control. So there's definitely value with using these products in rotation with single sites and in rotation with multi-site fungicides to manage your diseases of concern. If you want to learn more about FRAC codes, I encourage you to go to www.frac.info. There you're going to find the fungicide resistance management recommendations by crops, since I can't speak knowledgeably about anything more than just apple. It will also give you a list of the pathogens most at risk for fungicide resistance development. I'll give you a hint. Botrytis, gray mold is one of the worst ones. It can snap up fungicide resistance real quick. So if you're dealing with gray molds, for example, in strawberry production or small fruit production, that's a huge concern. Also, and most, I'd say importantly, you're going to find the FRAC pathogen risk code list right here. And this is this master list of FRAC codes, which is going to break down all of the available fungicides by their FRAC code and by their mode of action, so you can make sure that you're rotating most effectively. So what have we learned? FRAC codes are developed to facilitate fungicide resistance management in crops worldwide. Their goal is to prolong the effectiveness of the limited tools that we have to manage fungal diseases. It's very important that you know the group code for the fungicides that you're using to avoid rotating among chemically similar fungicides. It might be easy to use the same product over and over and over, but you're going to be better served in the long run by buying a handful of products with different FRAC codes and making sure that you're using them in rotation all season long. Once you've established fungicide resistant populations in your field or orchard, it's not guaranteed that they're ever going to go back to being a sensitive version of themselves. And you're going to have lost a very limited, expensive tool, not only for yourself, but for those who come after you to grow in those locations. I'd be more than happy to take any questions that you have about fungicide resistance. And if you have some apple questions, I guess I can take a shot at those as well. Thanks very much for your attention.
I have just a question on that FRAC info, David.
Sure.
How often does the that FRAC group typically update their their PDF and their info? I know in the last couple of years we've seen some changes in terms of which of groupings and how some newer products and newer biologicals are grouped. Is that typical, or do you any predictions on where that's going to go?
Yeah, so the FRAC group is very active and they update that PDF every single year. So you can get the most current one. Hopefully it's live by now for 2020. Well, actually it is, because I took that screenshot just the other week when I built the talk. So yep, there's the 2021 is available. Now, whether or not all the different companies get their labels updated, if the FRAC groups change, that's on them. I'm assuming there's a lot of legal repercussions if they don't. So it should be current as well. I see a question from Laura Perkins. Do fungi build up resistance to copper or sulfur? Short answer, no. And that's a great thing, right? So copper and sulfur, the inorganics fungicides, they're broad spectrum. So it's just merely the contact of these compounds that are going to kill the fungi itself or the fungal spores that it produces. It's going to be able to burn those out. So our concerns of resistance development is next to nothing. So you can use those products effectively, but there's also other concerns for using just sulfur or just copper. For example, the environmental effects, right, of dumping these. It usually takes a lot more of these compounds to manage diseases, as well as the residue that you find in your crop. So that's why we try to rotate those with single sites and biopesticides. Tony, you asked, do protectants mixed with systemic fungicides in rotations help with chances of resistance? And short answer, yes, they do. And for example, with that table I had of the apple grower who rotated between some multi-sites and some single sites, that was the goal there, right? So let's say you've got a situation where the grower is only going to be using one single site. We know that's a bad idea. I hope I've established that in this talk. But let's say that they are going to use Approvia all season long for the next 5 years. That is much worse than using Approvia all season long, but alternating it with a multi-site. Both of those are bad ideas. This is just for the sake of example. But what's happening in the situation where the grower is using approvia and then sulfur and then approvia and then sulfur instead of just approvia, FRAC 7, FRAC 7, FRAC 7, is that it's giving that window, if assuming that there's a 10 to 14 day window between applications, that sulfur window means that there's now going to be, 20 some odd days between an approvia application and an approvia application, meaning that you're going to kill off hopefully resistant isolates with your broad spectrum sulfur application, your protectants, and you're not going to keep selecting for resistance by wiping out just sensitive isolates and allowing the resistant isolate to take over all of that free real estate. So that was for the sake of example. Obviously, make sure you are, rotate your protectants and single sites, but make sure also you're rotating your single sites within your single site applications to make sure that you get the best possible result. But that is why the use of protectants is so effective to manage resistance development among single site fungicides. Great question.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.